It was a chilly evening in Ridgewood, a small town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional sound of cars passing by or leaves rustling in the wind. Two police officers, Garrett and Hensley, were on patrol that night. They weren't new to the job. Both had been serving for over 15 years. But something about them set people on edge. It wasn't just their uniforms or badges. It was the way they carried themselves. Their reputation preceded them. People whispered about how they always seemed to target certain groups, especially those with darker skin tones. That night, as they drove through the dimly lit streets, Garrett spotted someone walking alone. It was a young man, probably in his late 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He was heading toward the quieter part of town where most folks lived in modest homes. There was nothing unusual about him, no suspicious behavior, no running or hiding, just a regular guy walking home after what looked like a long day. But Garrett leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield. "Hey, does he look familiar?" he asked Hensley. Hensley shrugged. "Not really. Why?" "I don't know," Garrett said, his voice low. "He kind of fits the description of that robbery suspect we've been looking for." Hensley raised an eyebrow. "You mean the vague description? Tall, dark-skinned, hoodie? Half the town could fit that profile." Garrett ignored him. "Still, better safe than sorry." And without another word, he turned on the siren and pulled up behind the young man. The man froze when he heard the siren. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't run. Instead, he stopped and turned around slowly, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't carrying anything dangerous. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly. Garrett stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his holster. "Where are you coming from?" he barked. "Work," the man replied. "I'm just heading home. What's your name?" Garrett demanded. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. John Rivers." "Well, John," Garrett sneered, "you match the description of someone we're looking for, so we're going to need you to come with us." John's eyes widened. "What? That's ridiculous. I haven't done anything wrong." Hensley stayed silent, leaning against the car while Garrett took charge. Deep down, even he thought this felt off. But he didn't say anything. After all, it wasn't his place to question Garrett, not here, not now. John tried to reason with them. "Look, I have ID. I can prove who I am. You're making a mistake." But Garrett wasn't listening. He grabbed John's arm roughly and twisted it behind his back, snapping handcuffs into place. "Save it for the station," he muttered as John was shoved into the back seat of the squad car. He stared out the window, his mind racing. How could this be happening? He had done everything right, followed the rules, kept his head down, worked hard. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply because of how he looked. The drive to the station was short but felt endless. Garrett and Hensley exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, though neither spoke. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe indifference. But whatever it was, it lingered heavily in the air. When they arrived, John was led inside, still protesting his innocence. The cold metal cuffs dug into his wrists, but the ache in his chest hurt far worse. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped someone would realize the truth before it was too late. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a story that would change lives forever, including those of the men who arrested him. The young man's arrest didn't go unnoticed. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood, especially among those who knew him. It wasn't long before his mother heard about what had happened. She lived just a few blocks away in a modest house with peeling paint and a small garden out front. Her name was Mrs. Rivers, and she had raised her son alone after his father passed away years ago. Life hadn't been easy for them, but she always made sure her boy stayed on the right path. When a neighbor knocked on her door late that night to tell her the news, Mrs. Rivers felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her feet. At first, she thought it was some kind of cruel joke. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "Not my son. He wouldn't do anything wrong." But the neighbor insisted. It was true. He'd seen the police car pull up and take him away. Mrs. Rivers didn't waste a single moment. She threw on her coat, grabbed her purse, and rushed out into the cold night air. Her heart pounded as she walked briskly toward the police station. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by fear and disbelief. How could this happen? Her son worked hard, paid his bills, and treated people with respect. He was the kind of person who held doors open for strangers and offered to help neighbors carry groceries. The idea that he could be accused of something so serious seemed impossible. When she arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights above the entrance buzzed loudly, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. Inside, the room was stark and impersonal. Rows of metal chairs lined the walls, and a desk clerk sat behind thick glass typing on an old computer. Mrs. Rivers approached the counter, clutching her coat tightly around her chest. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm here about my son. They brought him in tonight." The clerk glanced up briefly, uninterested. "Name?" he asked flatly. "John Rivers," she replied. "They arrested him earlier. Please, I need to know why." The clerk sighed and typed the name into the system. After a moment, he nodded. "Yeah, he's here. You'll have to wait for the detective to come out and explain." Mrs. Rivers sank into one of the cold metal chairs, her hands clasped together tightly. As she waited, her mind raced. What if they didn't believe her? What if they refused to listen? She couldn't let that happen, not without a fight. When the detective finally appeared, a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes, she stood up immediately, her posture straight and resolute. "I want to see my son," she demanded, her voice steady despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "And I want to know why he's being held." The detective hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her intensity. "Ma'am, we received a report of a robbery earlier today," he began cautiously. "Your son matches the description of the suspect." "That's not good enough," Mrs. Rivers shot back, her voice rising slightly. "You think I don't know my own child? He works at the grocery store downtown. Ask anyone there. They'll tell you he's never caused trouble. He's not a thief." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. For a moment, the detective looked uncomfortable, as if he were beginning to doubt the situation himself. Still, he tried to maintain his composure. "Look, ma'am, these things take time. We're following procedure. If your son is innocent, it'll come out eventually." But Mrs. Rivers wasn't satisfied with vague promises. "Eventually isn't good enough," she snapped. "Every minute you keep him locked up is another minute you're ruining his life. Is that what you want on your conscience?" Her passion struck a chord, not just with the detective but also with some of the other officers nearby. One younger cop, barely out of his 20s, shifted awkwardly in his seat. Another exchanged a glance with a colleague, their expressions unreadable but tinged with discomfort. Even the toughest people in the room couldn't ignore the raw emotion pouring out of her. She wasn't yelling or threatening. She was pleading, begging them to see the truth. Finally, the detective relented. "All right, ma'am," he said softly. "Let me check on his status. I'll see what I can do." Mrs. Rivers nodded, though her body remained tense. She wasn't going anywhere until she saw her son face to face. As she sat back down, she whispered a silent prayer, hoping against hope that justice would prevail. Deep down, she knew this wasn't just about John. It was about every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety, every family torn apart by misunderstandings and prejudice. Hours passed, each one feeling longer than the last. Finally, a door creaked open and John was led into the waiting area. His wrists were still cuffed and his face was pale with exhaustion. But when he saw his mother standing there, her arms stretched wide, something inside him broke. He stumbled forward, falling into her embrace as tears streamed down both their faces. "I'm sorry, Mom," he choked out. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, baby," she murmured, holding him close. "I know." In that moment, the weight of the injustice hit her harder than ever. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a much bigger problem. And as she held her son, vowing to fight for his freedom no matter what it took, she realized this was only the beginning of a battle they would have to face together. Back at the precinct, Things weren't as calm as they seemed on the surface. Garrett and Hensley had returned to their desks after booking the young man, but neither of them looked particularly comfortable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. Papers were scattered around, coffee cups half empty, and the faint hum of police radios filled the room. But despite the usual chaos of a busy station, there was an uneasy silence between the two officers. Garrett leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the edge of his desk. His foot bounced nervously under the table, though he tried to act like everything was normal. Hensley, on the other hand, stared blankly at the computer screen in front of him, scrolling through files without really seeing them. Both men knew something wasn't sitting right, but neither wanted to say it out loud. Yet, finally, Garrett broke the silence. "Hey, did we actually check the security footage from that robbery?" he asked casually, though his tone betrayed a hint of doubt. Hensley paused, glancing up. "Not yet. Thought dispatch said they'd send it over." "Well, maybe we should double-check," Garrett muttered, avoiding eye contact. He pulled up the email chain and found the attachment labeled robbery footage. With a deep breath, he clicked play. The grainy black and white video flickered to life on the screen. It showed the convenience store where the robbery had taken place earlier that day. A figure entered the frame wearing a hoodie pulled low over their face. They moved quickly, shoving items into a bag before rushing out the door. Garrett leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "Wait a second," he murmured, rewinding the clip to get a better look. When he played it again, the truth became painfully clear. The person in the video didn't match the description of the man they'd arrested. Not even close. This guy was shorter, stockier, and walked with a slight limp. Plus, the hoodie he wore had a distinctive logo on the back. Something completely different from what their suspect had been wearing. Hensley let out a low whistle. "That's not him," he said quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's definitely not our guy." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what they'd done hung heavy in the air. Garrett leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and burying his face in his hands. "We messed up," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Big time." Hensley nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. "Yeah, we did. What are we going to do about it?" Garrett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. If we come clean now, it'll make us look bad. People will think we're incompetent. Or worse. And if we don't?" Hensley shot back, raising an eyebrow. "What happens when someone else figures this out? Because trust me, someone will." They sat in silence for a while, the reality of their mistake sinking in. Neither of them had intended to arrest an innocent person. They'd just acted on instinct, fueled by years of bias and assumptions. But now, faced with undeniable evidence, they couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Still, admitting fault wasn't easy, not for men like them who prided themselves on being tough and unshakable. Meanwhile, locked away in a holding cell down the hall, John sat alone with his thoughts. The cold metal bench beneath him offered no comfort, and the dull ache in his wrists reminded him of the handcuffs that had cut into his skin earlier. He replayed the events of the night over and over in his mind, trying to make sense of how it had all gone so wrong. At first, anger burned inside him, a fiery mix of frustration and helplessness. How could they accuse him of something he hadn't done, just because he happened to be walking home at the wrong time? But as the hours dragged on, the anger began to fade, replaced by a deeper sadness. He thought about his mom, about how hard she worked to give him a good life. He thought about his co-workers, his friends, the people who knew him and trusted him. None of them would believe he could commit a crime like this. So why had these officers jumped to such a conclusion? John closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cool concrete wall. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what freedom felt like. To walk outside without fear, to live without constantly having to prove his worth. But the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway snapped him back to reality. Someone was coming. The door creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside. "Come with me," he said, gruff. The next morning, the quiet town of Ridgewood was jolted awake by news of another robbery. This time it happened just a few blocks away from where John had been arrested the night before. A local bakery was hit early in the morning, and this time, there were witnesses, real ones. People who saw the thief up close, got a good look at his face, and even managed to snap a blurry photo with their phone as he ran off. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the time Garrett and Hensley arrived at the scene, a small crowd had gathered outside the bakery. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patel, stood near the entrance, visibly shaken but eager to help. "He came in pretending to buy bread," she explained, her voice trembling. "Then he pulled out a knife and demanded cash. I gave him what I had, but he didn't hurt anyone. Thank God for that." Garrett pulled out his notepad, jotting down details while Hensley spoke to some of the bystanders. One man stepped forward holding up his phone. "I got a picture of him," he said. "Not great quality, but you can see his face." Hensley took the phone and examined the image closely. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to identify certain features. The suspect was white, with messy blonde hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, nothing like the hoodie John had been wearing when they arrested him. Hensley's stomach dropped as he realized what this meant. "Does this guy look familiar to you?" he asked Garrett quietly, showing him the photo. Garrett frowned, shaking his head. "Nope. Never seen him before." Then, after a pause, he added, "But we've definitely got the wrong person locked up right now." The realization hit them, both like a punch to the gut. Not only had they arrested an innocent man, but their mistake might have given the real criminal more time to escape. Or worse, commit another crime. For two officers who prided themselves on keeping their community safe, this was a bitter pill to swallow. Back at the station, the chief of police called Garrett and Hensley into his office. Chief Reynolds was a no-nonsense kind of guy, known for running a tight ship. His desk was cluttered with paperwork, and the blinds behind him were drawn, casting the room in shadow. When the two officers walked in, he gestured for them to sit, without saying a word. "So," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I hear we've got another robbery on our hands, and guess what? The suspect doesn't match the description of the guy you brought in last night." Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Hensley cleared his throat. "Chief, we, may have made a mistake." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "A mistake? You think that's what this is?" "It's not like that," Garrett interjected quickly. "We thought we were following protocol. We had a vague description and he fit it. At least we thought he did. But then we reviewed the security footage and..." "And?" Reynolds prompted, folding his arms across his chest. "It wasn't him," Hensley admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We arrested the wrong person." The room fell silent. Reynolds stared at them for what felt like an eternity, his jaw clenched tightly. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Do you understand what this means? Do you realize the damage this could do to this department, to your careers, and most importantly, to that young man's life?" Both officers nodded solemnly. They knew exactly what he meant. Arresting someone based on flimsy evidence was bad enough, but letting a dangerous criminal slip through their fingers because of it, that was unforgivable. "Get him released immediately," Reynolds ordered, his tone sharp and final. "And start working on finding the actual suspect. I don't care if you have to stay here all night, I want results." As they left the office, Garrett and Hensley exchanged uneasy glances. They'd dodged a bullet this time, but they knew the fallout wouldn't be easy. Word would get out about their blunder, and trust in the department would take a hit. More than anything, they couldn't shake the guilt of knowing they'd wrongfully accused an innocent person. Meanwhile, John was sitting in his cell, staring at the wall. The hours had dragged on endlessly, each one heavier than the last. He'd tried to stay calm, reminding himself that the truth would eventually come to light. But doubt crept in anyway. What if no one believed him? What if they decided to charge him anyway just to save face? Just as these thoughts swirled in his mind, the door to the holding area opened. An officer appeared carrying a clipboard. "You're free to go," he announced flatly. John blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. What? The charges against you have been dropped. Someone else has been identified as the suspect. Relief washed over him like a tidal wave, but it was mixed with anger and exhaustion. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers, to scream at the injustice of it all. But instead he simply stood up, his legs wobbly from hours of sitting still. As he followed the officer out of the cell, he caught sight of his mother waiting anxiously in the lobby. She rushed toward him, wrapping her arms around him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mom," he replied softly, though his voice cracked under the weight of everything he'd been through. "Let's just get out of here." As they walked out of the station together, John couldn't help but glance back at the building one last time. He didn't feel victorious or vindicated, just drained. Deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The scars of this experience would linger, not just for him, but for everyone involved. And while justice might have prevailed in this moment, the bigger fight was far from finished. The days following John's release were anything but quiet. News of the wrongful arrest spread like wildfire through Ridgewood, thanks in part to Mrs. Rivers, who refused to let the matter rest. She wasn't angry in the way some might expect. There was no shouting or public outbursts, but her determination burned brighter than ever. She visited local community centers, spoke at town hall meetings, and even reached out to reporters from nearby cities. Her message was clear. This isn't just about my son. It's about every person who has been treated unfairly because of their skin color. For Garrett and Hensley, life became a whirlwind of scrutiny and self-reflection. Word of their mistake had leaked beyond the police department, making its way into conversations at grocery stores, schools, and coffee shops. Some people defended them, saying mistakes happen in any job. Others weren't so forgiving, calling for accountability and change within the force. The tension weighed heavily on both men, especially since they knew deep down that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern they'd contributed to over the years. Chief Reynolds didn't waste time addressing the situation head-on. He called an emergency meeting with all officers, including Garrett and Hensley, to discuss what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. The room buzzed with nervous energy as everyone filed in, taking their seats around a long table. When Reynolds stood up to speak, his voice carried a mix of frustration and resolve. "What happened here is unacceptable," he began, pacing slowly back and forth. "We're supposed to protect and serve, not make assumptions based on appearances. This isn't just a failure of judgment, it's a failure of trust. And if we don't fix this, we risk losing the respect of the very people we swore to protect." Garrett and Hensley exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the chief was speaking directly to them, even though he never mentioned their names. For once, neither of them tried to defend themselves. Instead, they sat quietly, listening as Reynolds outlined a series of reforms aimed at improving transparency and fairness within the department. These included mandatory diversity training sessions, stricter guidelines for arrests, and regular check-ins with community leaders to address concerns. After the meeting, Hensley pulled Garrett aside. "Do you think any of this will actually work?" he asked, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know," Garrett admitted, sighing deeply. "But I do know one thing. We can't keep doing things the way we've always done them. Not after what happened." Hensley nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Changing habits wasn't easy, especially when those habits had been ingrained over decades. Still, they both agreed to give the new initiatives a chance. If nothing else, they owed it to John and to themselves to try. Meanwhile, John tried to pick up the pieces of his life. Physically, he was free, but emotionally, he felt trapped. The experience had left him raw, questioning everything he thought he knew about fairness and justice. Every time he passed a police car on the street, his heart raced. Every knock on the door made him tense. Even going to work felt different now, as if people looked at him differently despite his innocence. His mother noticed the toll it was taking on him. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table eating dinner, she reached across and placed a hand on his arm. "You need to talk to someone," she said gently. "A counselor, maybe, or someone from the community center. You can't carry this alone." John hesitated, staring down at his plate. "I'm fine, Mom," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. "It's just hard, knowing that none of it would have happened if I didn't look the way I do." Mrs. Rivers squeezed his hand tightly. "That's not your fault. None of this is your fault, but bottling it up won't help either. Promise me you'll at least think about talking to someone." Reluctantly, John nodded. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. Keeping everything bottled inside wasn't helping. It was only making things worse. Over the next few days, he started attending support group meetings organized by local activists. At first, he felt out of place, unsure of what to say or how to share his story. But as he listened to others recount similar experiences, something shifted inside him. He realized he wasn't alone. There were others who understood exactly what he was going through, and that connection gave him strength. As weeks turned into months, Garrett and Hensley found themselves attending diversity training sessions alongside other officers. At first, they approached these sessions with skepticism, rolling their eyes at role-playing exercises and awkward discussions about privilege. But gradually, something began to sink in. Hearing firsthand accounts from residents who had faced discrimination, not just from law enforcement but in schools, workplaces, and everyday interactions, forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. One particular session stood out. A young woman shared her story of being pulled over repeatedly for minor infractions simply because of her race. Each stop left her feeling humiliated and powerless, as if she were being judged not for her actions but for her appearance. As she spoke, Garrett caught himself thinking back to his own behavior during traffic stops. Had he ever made someone feel that way? The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By the end of the session, both Garrett and Hensley felt a strange mix of guilt and motivation. They couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, they could start making amends. For the first time in a long time, they felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but if they stayed committed, perhaps they could rebuild some of the trust they'd lost. And while progress was slow, small signs of improvement began to show. Officers started engaging more openly with residents during neighborhood patrols, asking questions instead of jumping to conclusions. Community meetings became less formal and more collaborative, with both sides working together to find solutions. It wasn't perfect, in fact it was far from it, but it was a start. For John, seeing these changes unfold brought a sense of cautious optimism. He still carried the scars of his ordeal, but he also recognized the importance of forgiveness and growth. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, for him, for the officers, or for the town as a whole. But as long as people kept trying, kept pushing for better, there was reason to believe that healing was possible. Months passed and the town of Ridgewood began to feel different. Not entirely transformed, but there were subtle shifts, moments that hinted at progress. For Garrett and Hensley, the journey toward redemption wasn't easy. It required more than just attending training sessions or following new guidelines. It demanded a complete reevaluation of who they were as people and as officers. They had spent years building walls around themselves, convinced that toughness and authority were the same thing. Now those walls were starting to crack. One day, Chief Reynolds assigned them to a newly formed task force aimed at rebuilding trust between the police department and marginalized communities. The idea behind the initiative was simple: bring officers face-to-face with residents in non-confrontational settings. Instead of patrolling streets with guns holstered and radios chirping, they'd sit down over coffee, attend community events, and listen, really listen to the concerns of the people they served. At first, Garrett and Hensley weren't thrilled about the assignment. "This feels like punishment," Garrett grumbled as they drove to their first meeting. "Like we're being paraded around to prove a point." Hensley shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "Maybe it is. But if it helps fix some of the damage we've done, isn't it worth it?" Garrett didn't respond right away. He stared out the window, watching the familiar streets roll by. These were neighborhoods he'd patrolled for years, yet suddenly, they felt foreign. He realized he barely knew the people who lived here, their names, their stories, their struggles. All he'd ever seen were stereotypes, assumptions, and biases. That realization hit him harder than he expected. The meeting took place in a small community center tucked away in one of Ridgewood's quieter neighborhoods. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and a table held snacks and drinks. A handful of residents sat chatting softly, while others lingered near the door, hesitant to join. Garrett and Hensley walked in together, both feeling out of place. Their uniforms drew immediate attention, and the room fell silent. An older woman stepped forward, breaking the awkwardness. Her name was Mrs. Thompson, and she'd been organizing these meetings for years. She greeted the officers warmly, though her smile carried a hint of caution. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We're glad to have you here." Garrett nodded stiffly, unsure what to say. Hensley offered a weak smile, muttering a quiet thanks. Neither man felt particularly welcome, but they stayed anyway, taking seats near the back of the circle. As the discussion began, residents shared their experiences, stories of being stopped without cause, of feeling targeted when walking through certain parts of town, of fearing for their children's safety simply because of the color of their skin. Some spoke passionately, their voices trembling with emotion. Others kept their tone measured, choosing words carefully. Each story added another layer to the heavy weight already resting on Garrett and Hensley's shoulders. Then, unexpectedly, John entered the room. He hesitated in the doorway, scanning the space until his eyes landed on the two officers. For a moment, everything froze. Garrett and Hensley exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to react. Would he confront them? Yell at them? Walk out? Instead, John moved slowly toward an empty chair, sitting across from them in the circle. His presence commanded attention, though he said nothing at first. When it was his turn to speak, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm not here to argue or accuse," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here because I want things to change for me, for my family, for everyone. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. But yelling or blaming won't fix anything. We need understanding. We need honesty." His words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. Garrett felt his chest tighten, guilt washing over him in waves. Hensley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Neither man had expected this. Not anger, not accusations, but grace. When the meeting ended, most attendees filed out quietly, exchanging polite goodbyes. Garrett and Hensley lingered near the exit, unsure whether to leave or stay. John approached them before they could decide. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence stretched taut, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, John extended his hand. "I don't forgive you because what you did was okay," he said, his gaze steady. "I forgive you because holding on to hate won't change anything. And honestly, I think you're trying. That counts for something." Garrett stared at the offered hand, stunned. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached out and shook it. Hensley followed suit, his grip firm but tentative. In that brief exchange, something shifted. A spark of connection, however fragile, ignited between them. Driving back to the station later that evening, neither officer spoke. The weight of the day pressed heavily on their minds, but it wasn't the crushing burden of guilt they'd grown accustomed to. It was something else, something lighter, yet still profound. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the faintest glimmer of possibility. Over the weeks that followed, Garrett and Hensley threw themselves into the task force with renewed energy. They attended more meetings, participated in workshops, and even volunteered at local events. At first, their efforts were met with skepticism. Residents eyed them warily, unsure whether their actions were genuine or merely performative. But over time, small gestures began to make a difference. Garrett struck up conversations with shopkeepers during routine patrols, asking about their businesses and families rather than immediately jumping to questions about crime. Hensley joined a youth mentorship program, spending weekends coaching basketball and sharing life lessons with teenagers who reminded him of his own son. Both men found themselves learning as much as they were teaching, gaining insights into lives vastly different from their own. For John, seeing this transformation unfold brought a mix of emotions. Part of him remained guarded, unwilling to fully trust the system that had failed him. But another part, a bigger part, felt a cautious optimism. He started volunteering alongside Garrett and Hensley at community events, leading discussions about racial bias and systemic inequality. Though their interactions were often awkward at first, they gradually grew more natural, built on mutual respect and shared goals. One evening, after a particularly lively town hall meeting, John found himself standing beside Garrett outside the venue. The air was cool, and the streetlights cast soft halos on the pavement. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You know," Garrett said finally, breaking the silence, "I used to think I had all the answers, that I knew what was best for this town, for its people. Turns out I didn't know anything." John chuckled softly. "Nobody expects you to have all the answers," he replied. "Just keep asking the right questions." Garrett nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Fair enough." As they parted ways, John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in himself, but in the small steps being taken toward a better future. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But every effort mattered, no matter how small. And in those moments of connection, however fleeting, hope began to take root. Years rolled by, and Ridgewood began to feel like a different place. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but the changes were noticeable. The town still had its share of challenges, but there was a growing sense that people were finally listening to each other. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening in living rooms, classrooms, and even patrol cars. Garrett and Hensley had become unlikely symbols of this shift, not because they were heroes, but because they represented something rare: accountability. Their transformation didn't happen overnight. It came in fits and starts, through awkward conversations, uncomfortable realizations, and moments of genuine connection. At first, their colleagues at the station raised eyebrows. Some teased them for going soft, while others dismissed their efforts as an attempt to save face after their mistake. But over time, even the skeptics began to see the impact of their work. Garrett and Hensley became regular fixtures at community events. They weren't just showing up to check a box. They were actively engaging. Garrett found himself mentoring teenagers in the youth outreach program, sharing stories about his own rough childhood and the mistakes he'd made along the way. He discovered that these kids weren't so different from him when he was their age. They craved guidance, respect, and someone who believed in them, even if they didn't always admit it. Hensley, meanwhile, took on a leadership role in the diversity training sessions. Once reluctant to participate, he now stood before groups of officers recounting his own journey of self-reflection. "I used to think I knew everything," he'd say, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "But the truth is, I didn't know anything. And until we're willing to admit that, we can't grow." His honesty resonated with many of the younger officers, who often approached him afterward to ask questions or share their own struggles. For Hensley, these interactions were humbling. He realized that change wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about shaping the future. As for John, his life took on new meaning. After months of attending support group meetings and volunteering with local activists, he decided to take things a step further. He started organizing workshops aimed at educating people about racial bias and systemic inequality. His approach was simple yet powerful. He shared his story, openly and honestly, without sugarcoating the pain or minimizing the injustice. One evening, during a packed community forum, John stood at the front of the room, addressing a diverse crowd of residents, students and law enforcement officials. "What happened to me shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But it did. And instead of letting it break me, I chose to use it as fuel, to fight for something bigger than myself." The audience erupted into applause, but John held up a hand, silencing them. "This isn't about me," he continued. "It's about all of us. About learning to see each other as human beings, not stereotypes, not statistics, but people. That's where real change begins. Sitting in the back of the room, Garrett and Hensley exchanged glances. They had heard John speak many times before, but tonight felt different. There was a weight to his words, a clarity that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Both men felt a surge of pride, not because they had played a part in his journey, but because they had witnessed it. After the event, Garrett approached John near the refreshment table. "That was incredible," he said, offering a small smile. "You really have a gift for this," John chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not a gift, it's just telling the truth. Something you two taught me to appreciate." Garrett laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, I'm glad we got something right." The three of them stood there for a moment, chatting casually about the event and the turnout. It was surreal how far they'd come, from adversaries to allies, from mistrust to mutual respect. Neither side had forgotten the past, but they had learned to carry it differently, as a reminder of where they'd been, rather than a barrier to where they could go. Over time, Garrett and Hensley's involvement in the community deepened. They began attending school assemblies, talking to students about safety, responsibility, and the importance of treating everyone fairly. Kids who might have once feared them now greeted them with smiles and high fives. Parents who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to thank them for their efforts. Even Chief Reynolds noticed the difference. During one department meeting, he singled out Garrett and Hensley for their dedication. "Change doesn't happen because of policies or programs," he said, looking directly at them. "It happens because of people, because of choices. You two are proof of that." The room erupted into applause, leaving both men red-faced and embarrassed. But beneath the surface, they felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. They hadn't done it for recognition. They'd done it because it was the right thing to do. And somehow, that made it mean even more. For John, seeing Garrett and Hensley embrace their roles as advocates filled him with hope. He knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult. Racism and prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight. But every step forward mattered, no matter how small. Every handshake, every conversation, every act of kindness chipped away at the walls that divided people. One afternoon, as John walked home from the grocery store, he passed a police car parked near the park. Garrett was inside, chatting with a group of kids playing basketball. When one of them spotted John, they waved excitedly, shouting, "Hey, Mr. J, come join us." John smiled, waving back. For a moment, he considered joining them, but instead, he kept walking, savoring the warmth of the sun on his face. As he turned the corner onto his street, he thought about how far they'd all come, and how much farther they still had to go. In that moment, John realized something important. Healing wasn't about erasing the scars of the past. It was about learning to live with them, using them as reminders of resilience and growth. And though the journey wasn't easy, it was worth it. For him, for Garrett and Hensley, and for everyone else trying to build a better world one step at a time. Years later, Ridgewood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, but they were healing. Slowly, unevenly, but steadily. Garrett and Hensley became unlikely symbols of hope, not because they were perfect, but because they reminded everyone that change was possible. Even for those who had made mistakes, their journey wasn't easy. There were setbacks along the way, moments when old habits crept back, or when people questioned their sincerity, but they stayed committed, showing up day after day, even when it felt like no one noticed. They worked tirelessly to mentor younger officers, teaching them the importance of empathy, patience, and accountability. "It's not about being liked," Garrett would say during training sessions. "It's about being trusted, and trust isn't given, it's earned." Hensley took this lesson to heart, becoming a bridge between the department and the community. He often attended neighborhood meetings, sitting quietly at first, listening more than speaking. Over time, residents began to open up to him, sharing concerns about everything from streetlights to school safety. These conversations weren't glamorous, but they mattered. They showed people that their voices were heard, and that someone cared enough to act on them. For John, life moved forward too. His workshops grew in popularity, drawing crowds from neighboring towns and cities. People came not just to hear his story, but to learn how to tell their own. He encouraged them to speak honestly, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to believe in the power of dialogue. Change starts with a single conversation, he'd say, his voice steady and warm. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen. One summer evening, the town held its annual Unity Festival, AIO, celebration of diversity and resilience. Food trucks lined the streets, music filled the air, and laughter echoed through the park. It was a far cry from the tense, divided town Ridgewood used to be. At the center of the festivities stood a small stage, where local leaders, including Garrett, Hensley, and John, were invited to speak. When it was Garrett's turn to address the crowd, he stepped up to the microphone, visibly nervous. The sea of faces staring back at him included people he'd wronged, people he'd helped, and people he barely knew. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure where to begin. Then he cleared his throat and spoke from the heart. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "because I don't deserve it, not yet. What I want to do is thank you for holding me accountable, for pushing me to be better, and for giving me a chance to make things right. This town has taught me that mistakes don't define us. What defines us is what we do after we make them." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering louder than expected. Garrett looked out at the faces, many of which were smiling, some wiping away tears. Among them was John, nodding slowly, his expression thoughtful but kind. When it was John's turn to speak, he walked to the stage with quiet confidence. As he adjusted the microphone, he glanced at Garrett and Hensley, who stood nearby, watching him intently. "I never thought I'd stand here today," he began, his voice soft but clear. "Not because I didn't believe in myself, but because I didn't believe in others. I didn't think anyone would care about what happened to me, but I was wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "People like Garrett and Hensley proved me wrong. Not because they're perfect. They're not. But because they tried. Because they listened. Because they chose to grow instead of staying stuck in their old ways. That's what gives me hope, that we can all choose to grow." As he finished speaking, the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. John stepped back from the microphone, shaking hands with Garrett and Hensley as they joined him on stage. For a brief moment, the three of them stood together under the spotlight, united by a shared journey of struggle and redemption. After the festival ended, the trio lingered near the stage, chatting casually as the crowd dispersed. "You know," Hensley said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never imagined I'd end up here, doing this, being this person." John smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "None of us did. But that's the thing about growth. You don't get to plan it. You just have to show up and see where it takes you." Garrett nodded, gazing out at the emptying park. "We've still got a long way to go," he admitted, "but nights like this remind me why it's worth it." They parted ways soon after, each carrying the weight of the evening in their hearts. For Garrett and Hensley, it was a reminder of how far they'd come, and how much work remained. For John, it was proof that resilience and forgiveness could pave the way for something beautiful. In the years that followed, Ridgewood continued to evolve. New challenges arose, as they always do, but the foundation of trust and understanding laid by people like Garrett, Hensley, and John helped the town face them head-on. Their story became a testament to the power of humility, courage, and connection. A reminder that while mistakes can't be undone, sincere efforts to make amends can heal wounds and build bridges. And though none of them ever forgot the night that brought them together, they also knew it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something bigger, a journey toward justice, compassion, and unity that would ripple through generations to come.